Okay, so here we are in chapter 1. What many would generally say is the really important chapter for setting the stage of what economics is. Now, different authors of different books do different things here in terms of how to set this up properly. I kind of like how the authors, Coppock and Mateer and Coppock, how they set this up. And they basically set it up as that the discipline of economics has essentially 5 foundational theories or concepts that kind of guide what's all happening. Now, the obvious big questions here are first, what is the discipline? What is economics? And what are these 5 foundations? Now, generally in a lecture, I don't like things to be a murder mystery here, where we got to wait and wait and wait for what the appropriate answer is here. So let me just speak to them right now. If you were to say to me, like, what is economics, right? I mean, I could kind of ask it as a blanket question right now, but essentially, if you were to ask me, what I would say, as kind of our quick definition here, is that economics is a science of scarcity. That economics is a science of scarcity. And so first I'll apologize too, I didn't set up my digital pen, so I can't write on the slides right now, but I promise you that for the chapters here after chapter 1, I will be writing on the slides. So economics, what is economics? For me, it is the science of scarcity. Now the question then is what is scarcity? And the idea of what scarcity is that we have unlimited wants, and we have a fairly large number of needs. So we have all these wants and needs, but we only have limited resources to meet all of those wants and needs. And the question becomes one of, how do we allocate our time? How do we allocate our resources? How do we allocate our money to being able to satisfy certain wants and needs? And that economics then is the discipline where we try to understand, try to make methodical how we're going to meet all of these wants and needs with only a small amount of resources. So that's how I would reply about what economics is. Then the other question becomes, what are these 5 foundations? Well, rather than talking about what those 5 foundations are, let me just kind of get into the slides here. So, if we look at economics as a science of scarcity, as meeting these unlimited wants and needs with limited resources, then the discipline pretty quickly splits off into 2 major parts, macroeconomics and microeconomics. This course is the macroeconomics course. What that means for us is that in macroeconomics, as the first part of the title suggests, we look at things on an economy-wide basis. We look at big picture things, how the entire economy operates and meets its wants and needs. Macroeconomics of these 2, macroeconomics is heard about a great deal more because it's in the news all the time. That would be phrases like GDP, inflation, unemployment. All of those are macroeconomic terms. Of these 2 fields, macroeconomics is the newest. It generally dates back to about the 1930s, with the kind of the primary first theorist of macroeconomics being John Maynard Keynes, who you may have heard of. He was born on June 5th, my birthday. Yeah, he's a fellow Gemini. So we've got John Maynard Keynes, let's call him the father of macroeconomics, born on June 5th. And then we've got microeconomics. Microeconomics, we're looking here at smaller parts of the economy. We're talking about individual firms, individual people, and how they satisfy their wants and needs in this idea of scarcity. When we think of microeconomics, it's a much older field. It dates back to well, some would say it dates back to the ancient Greeks and whatnot, but let's not go back that far here, unless you're going to take history of economic thought with me. Then we will go back that far. But in microeconomics, we generally think of the father of microeconomics as being Adam Smith, who in 1776 wrote a rather famous book. Well, he wrote two famous books, but the one that people focus on primarily is called The Wealth of Nations, which is a book that looked at why is England so rich and why is Portugal so poor, essentially. And while he's exploring this topic of why is England so rich and Portugal so poor, and he wrote this book in 1776, he ended up giving the emergence to microeconomics as a field. Fun fact, Adam Smith was born on June 5th as well. That's right, my birthday. So we've got 3 Geminis here. Keynes, Smith, me. We're not going to talk a great deal about microeconomics here. About the only thing we'll really talk about that has any semblance of microeconomics would be what we're going to do in chapters 2 and chapters 3 when we're talking about supply and demand and international trade. Now, as we turn to what these 5 foundations are of economics, that's going to be the majority of the time here that we spend in the rest of these slides here, that when we think of what is it that makes an economist, like, and I say this as a way to, when I, obviously I'm an academic, and so I talk to other academics, but what I find is that, I understand generally things when a political scientist is talking to me or a sociologist is talking to me. Like, I can kind of make sense of what they're saying. It's not like they're speaking a foreign language. But I seem to get along best with fellow economists. Now, why is that? Am I just too elitist? Am I too, I don't know, concerned about my own kind? No, that's not really the way. What I think it is that we just see the world in the same way. I am a very typical economist. And what that means is that I do think of the world in terms of these 5 things. So let me just talk briefly about the 5 things, and then in the slides we'll elaborate on them further. First, incentives. So, and also there would be disincentives. But to make an incentive means that you encourage someone to do something that you want them to do. So, for instance, I structured this entire course all around incentives. Because while my colleagues in other disciplines complain about students these days, how they don't do what they want them to do, etc., etc., I mean, my secret, why is my life so much simpler? How do I get you to do what I want you to do? I just create an incentive structure around it so that you are incentivized to do what I want you to do. Now, for some people, the incentive I provide is not enough. Well, then, that's a different issue. But for most of you, the incentive I provide is deep enough to get you to do what I want you to do. As an example, we're doing study modules in this course. I wouldn't be providing you much of an incentive to do it if I said, oh, it's practice, there's no grade, it doesn't help you in any way. How much of you do you think you would actually do the study module? Well, probably not very many. Now, on the other hand, you'll notice that I'm not incentivizing you directly to read the chapters of the book. It's just, people learn in different ways. I learn by reading. I learn by reading chapters of a book, but I think it's a bit presumptuous of me to think that everyone has to learn that way. And I'm not going to force you to learn that way. When I teach in person, I don't have an attendance policy. So what does that mean? Maybe half the class shows up every day. I tell people that the reason to come to class would be is that you're going to learn material you're going to need for the exam. But for some people, that incentive is not enough. Now, I could get 100% attendance, or pretty darn close to it, if I said, you'll get 1% of your grade for every day you show up to class. I guarantee you attendance would go up. I'm just not sure it's worth that. Second, trade-offs. A trade-off is essentially giving up something to get something else. And we measured that trade-off that must always seem to exist. The measurement of that trade-off is the opportunity cost. What do I give up? What is the highest valued thing I give up to get something else? Then we get to marginal thinking. Marginal thinking means that every time I decide to do something, and this has become really important for this idea of the unlimited wants, limited needs, and limited resources. So I get a paycheck, right? And that paycheck is generally the same amount every month. Well, if that's the case, then I have to make choices, right? I take my kids to the grocery store, and I'm constantly thinking about, if I get this, then I can't get that, right? Buying something might make my kids happier. That we're going to see is understood as the marginal benefit. But that the thing has a cost, right? Let's say it's $5. And I might make the conclusion that their additional happiness isn't worth that $5. Right? On the other hand, I might make that decision to buy them something if I think that their happiness is going to exceed whatever that cost to me is. And then we get to this fifth concept. And the fifth concept is that trade creates value. And what we mean by that is that that economists have this mantra, and that mantra is that free trade benefits all, which is a little bit different than, for instance, what you would see around you when you look at like politics and whatnot, where there's generally a set of politicians out there who are opposed to or against free trade. You're going to have a pretty hard time finding an economist who thinks that free trade is a bad thing. Now, it does create negative consequences, like people that work in the U.S. possibly losing their job. But what we're going to see in this chapter and in the next chapter is that, generally speaking, if you allow people to trade, it's a good thing. Okay. So we've got these kind of questions here, but I've already kind of spoken about much of these things here. So here we go, right? Here's our definition, our very formal definition of economics. I'm simplifying it to you in that I'm just calling it a science of scarcity. An idea that we have a systematic way of looking at the fact that we have all of these wants and needs, but limited resources to satisfy them. And that would be our definition of scarcity. Economics then is a discipline being how, well, it's generally a social science, but sometimes it's in a business department. But it's generally speaking a study of how people behave in this world, how they interact with others in this world. Here's our formal definition of scarcity. Again, that if economics is the science of scarcity, scarcity is the fact that we have limited resources. And what are resources? That would be time, money, natural resources to actually build things, I don't know, mental capacity, anything that we're using to make something else. And that basically we have only limited time. We have limited money to satisfy these wants and needs. Okay, I'm just going to skip these practice what you know. So then here's our separation of these two fields of micro and macro. Again, when you think of microeconomics, think of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. And we're looking at individual units. What would these individual units be? Individual people, businesses, and industries. So we could say like all of the airlines are an industry. American Airlines is a business. I am a person. Right? And so microeconomics could understand how me and all the other purchasers of air travel, how we behave when we're deciding whether to drive or fly, or whether we decide to go with American Airlines or some other airline. But microeconomics would also be a study of how does American Airlines interact with other airlines to determine how many seats to provide, how to charge for the fare. And then we could look at also then how industries interact with each other. How does the car rental industry interact with the hotel industry, which interacts with the airlines? So that you get kind of a sample microeconomics question, for instance, of how does, for instance, raising taxes, how does that affect businesses and just the retail industry in general? And then we've got macroeconomics, which again is the focus of our course here. But then we're looking again at overall aspects of the economy, the big picture. Again, when you think of macroeconomics, I want you to start to think of an individual like John Maynard Keynes. He wrote the book that he's probably most famous for called Theory of Money and Interest. He wrote it in England in 1932, if I'm not mistaken. 32 or 34. 1932 or 1934. And again, it became kind of the basis for the beginnings of the macroeconomic recovery plan that we did during the Great Depression. But even saying words like a recession, a depression, GDP, inflation, unemployment, these are all macroeconomic terms. Okay. So here we go now into what are incentives. As I kind of basically have said here, an incentive could either be a positive incentive or a negative incentive, and basically it's something that motivates me, encourages me to act in a certain way. The most common way we try to do things in general is that we try to provide positive incentives, meaning I give you an encouragement to do something. But sometimes we obviously have negative incentives, right? For instance, I don't speed because I don't want to get a speeding ticket, right? I don't get in accidents because I don't want my insurance to go up. So, right, so we can think of those kinds of simple things as a way to think about how the world can work better. So again, here's our kind of distinction between positive and negative incentives, which I've already said. Yeah, I should say this, extra credit for participating in class. We really won't have that much extra credit. I don't really like extra credit because I actually feel, now this is actually kind of good, I feel that it doesn't give you a good incentive to just do the existing work well. Right? Because if you know that there's extra credit, then you're going to feel like you can just kind of slack off a little bit and just make up for it with extra credit. I mean, it's more grading for me. It's more work for you. So in general, I don't really like to do extra credit, which I know you may dislike, but it does make sense maybe a little bit now with what I'm saying. And again, then we've got our negative incentives, punishment for doing something. So besides positive and negative incentives, we can also have what are called direct and indirect incentives. The direct incentive would be that I directly connect doing one thing to getting something else. As the second bullet point highlights here, it's pretty easy to recognize this, right? I do this with my kids all the time. If you don't cry with me dropping it, right? My 3-year-old Monroe, she had to start school yesterday, and of my kids, she was the one that was going to be most grumpy about going back to school. So I had to say to her, if you don't cry when you get out of the car, I will get you an ice cream cone at McDonald's after school. And sure enough, she did not cry. But you want to know what the first thing she asked for when she got out of school? Are we going to McDonald's to get that ice cream cone? Of course I had to provide it to her, right? Because if I didn't, then I'd be, I'm not going to get that kind of deal from her ever again. She's not going to trust me to be providing that direct incentives. I'm a pretty reliable direct incentive giver. Now, indirect incentives are a little bit more difficult to identify. And here you see things where, for instance, in my upper level class where students have to do a lot more writing, I really have to guard against, not plagiarism, but I really have to guard against AI. And it's hard because, right, the students just want to get the highest grade possible. I understand that incentive that they have. And obviously I give a good grade to well-written things, right? So now, in some sense, because they want to do so well and I want to see good writing and I only provide grades for good writing, they're being given an indirect incentive to cheat, to use AI. So I kind of have to watch it and make sure that they're not, that there's a pretty significant negative direct incentive to using AI, which would be that you don't end up doing as well, that you get a 0. And that's what kind of gives us too that sometimes what we see happening is that we have unintended consequences, which is that something unplanned happened as a consequence of something else going through. So for instance, they give you one example and then I'm going to provide another example. The fact that because we give people unemployment compensation, meaning we pay people money if they lose their job, then people don't have an incentive to go looking for a new job right away, right? So we basically create some higher unemployment because we make this unemployment compensation. Or another way of thinking of it, and this is the one that's in the news today, is that, if you've got food stamps can't be used for hot food, but you can use them, for instance, on candy and soda. And it turns out that most food stamp money, that the biggest category of purchases for food stamps are soda and other sugary drinks, which is not something that, generally speaking, if one were particularly poor and didn't have a lot of money, people might really rethink, why am I spending so much on soda of my own scarce money? So there are some people in government right now that want to stop people from being able to buy soda with food stamps. And there are also some people that say, poor people might be living out of their car, and so they don't have access to a stove or a microwave. Why aren't we allowing them to go, and buy hot food, for instance, like at the, at like a Safeway or something, buying like a prepared meal, right? Why are we stopping people from doing that? So, we have to think about these unintended consequences that emerge. Okay, again, in general, I'm going to skip these practice what you know, as I figure you can do that yourself. That gets us to now a second fundamental characteristic of economics, and that is the trade-off. That basically we have choices. Everything we decide to do means that we're not doing something else. So, there's your trade-off. Now, the point is that we have to measure what those trade-offs are. The measurement of that trade-off is this third concept, the opportunity cost. It is the highest valued thing that we give up when we decide to do something else. And the idea is that you should always be thinking of what the opportunity cost is. Some of you, right now are thinking about that loser kid that you knew in high school that decided not to go in college, but yet right now is working as a welder's apprentice and earning, buku bucks, being a welder or some other trade, right? Because they got to start work right away. People that are welders get paid good money, and here you are sitting in a classroom, right? Or sitting in your room watching this video. And you're thinking, geez, what if I'd given up to go to college? Right? It's not just the tuition. It's also your time. Right? And the idea is that if you choose to go to college and you haven't been forced to by your parents, the idea is that you should be thinking quite meaningfully about, what am I giving up to go to college? And is this the best thing that I could be doing with my time right now? If you already know that you're going to fail out of college, well, then you probably shouldn't even go for the first year, right? because what's the opportunity cost of going to college is going to be pretty high. A year of college just so that you can fail out. Why do that to yourself? And so that's what we see here, right? Is that there's an idea that there are direct costs, for instance, like tuition and books, right? But there's also your time. Now, what we're also seeing here is that what you cannot include in your opportunity cost, for instance, is housing and food. Because no matter what you decide, whether you're going to be a welder or whether you're going to, go to college, in both situations, you would presumably still be eating and still be living somewhere. So there's no additional, by choosing to go to college, you wouldn't be necessarily facing any higher housing or food prices than you would have otherwise. And that gets us to the third concept here, which is, our fourth concept, which is marginal thinking. So just to kind of review here, we did the idea that we face these trade-offs. These trade-offs can be measured with the opportunity cost, and that as economists, that incentives matter. So incentives matter. Trade-offs exist. The measurement of the trade-off is the opportunity cost. The fourth thing here is the idea that every time I decide to do something, I am comparing what am I benefiting it from doing it one more time versus what is it costing me to do it one more time. That marginal thinking, that comparison of the decisions would be where we're comparing here the marginal benefit to the marginal cost. Where you see the word marginal, you think of the synonym for it, which is additional. The additional benefit to the additional cost. And so, for instance, just like with the only example I can think of here, which comes across as a pretty poor example. I used to like this cartoon. The cartoon was King of the Hill. It was about this guy that sold propane and propane accessories. And there's this really funny thing where the father is like raising his kid, and the kid's like 9 years old or something, and he decides to start smoking cigarettes. And like the mom's just telling him, don't smoke cigarettes, stop doing it. And then Hank Hill, the guy that's the main character here, Hank Hill, the father, says, no, you know what? I'm going to stop my kid from smoking by buying him an entire carton of cigarettes. And then the kid, in return, just starts smoking and smoking and smoking all of the cigarettes until he starts throwing up. And then he stops smoking for good because he just got so sick from smoking cigarettes. Or I guess the more realistic example here is that I don't really like donuts anymore. And I know that might sound odd to some of you, but I used to work at a convenience store, and one of the things that we got to eat for free at the convenience store was you could eat as many donuts as you wanted to. And I did that first week, and now I just hate donuts. Right? The benefit doesn't seem very big, and all it does is give me back memories to that really bad job. Okay. And that gets us to the fifth concept here, which is this idea that, in general, if I had to summarize this, is that free trade benefits all. That being able to trade with each other generally brings about mutually beneficial conditions. That both the buyer and seller of something both benefit from the activity happening. Free trade benefits all. And that markets are structured to be able to allow trade to occur more efficiently. And so what it does for us is it creates this very simple circular flow diagram, where what we can understand then is that markets exist, for instance, markets for products, markets for resources, and that what happens in this marketplace setting is that households and firms sell goods and services, right? I sell to firms my labor services. I get from the company money in return for selling my labor. I then take my money and I buy products from firms, and the firms give me the products. And you can understand that now these movements going through these markets. I'm a household. I sell my labor. I sell my labor, and my labor is a resource. That resource is bought by the firm. That firm, in turn, pays money for the labor, which goes back to me. I take my money and I go to the product market, and I buy a product that was put on the market by a company, right? And the money I gave to the product market goes back to the firm, and I get the product. Generally speaking, again, this trade creates value, as long as the trade is voluntary, meaning both the buyer and seller aren't being persuaded or unfairly pushed to do something that they wouldn't have otherwise wanted to do. If you don't do trade, then you have to make everything yourself. And what we're going to see here in the next chapter, this is kind of our segue to the next chapter, what that does is it makes the market in general less efficient. And it makes it so that I can't consume as much as I would have been able to otherwise. And one of the key terms that's going to start to emerge in the next chapter is this idea of the comparative advantage. And the definition of the comparative advantage, which we'll reiterate again in the next chapter, is this idea that I can do something at a lower opportunity cost than someone else. And that concept will become a bit more apparent here in chapter 2. And so there we go. This has been our summary of the 5 concepts. And then our definition of economics, which again I think could just be simplified as to the science of scarcity, with the main fields being microeconomics and macroeconomics.